Fantasy isn't a genre. Science fiction, that's not a genre either. In fact, young adults, also not a genre. All those categories listed down the left side of Amazon when you're browsing books, those aren't genres either. I used to think these were genres too, and that misunderstanding was wrecking my books before I even wrote the first word. Now, my name is Tim Grahl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid, where every day I work with writers to help them build the skills, write a book, and leave their legacy. I'm the author of The Threshing, Running Down a Dream, and my upcoming book is called The Shithead. My partner, Sean Coyne, is the creator and founder of StoryGrid, and he's an editor and writer and story researcher with over 30 years of experience and a huge successful track record in the publishing industry. So everything I teach in this video and everything at StoryGrid is based on his extensive experience. This is a continued series on how I wrote my new book, The Shithead. In the previous video, I went over theme and how important figuring out your theme is for your story. So I'm going to put that link down in the description. So if you want to go back and watch that, I think you should start with that one. But for this one, I'm just going to tell you what my theme is. The controlling idea is true self-acceptance and inner peace are achieved not through conforming to societal expectations, but by embracing one's authentic self, even at the risk of external rejection. I want to move the reader from feeling like they're broken and need fixing to understand that they are perfect and have everything they need. This is going to be the through line for the entire book, and based on that, I can start making other decisions about my book. But if you don't have your theme set, then you're just kind of randomly deciding everything else about your book. Everything comes back to your theme, your controlling idea, the change you want to make in the reader. But now that I've got that set, the next thing we're going to look at is genre. Now, when we're talking about genre, we're actually talking about 5 different things. There's 5 different categories within genre that will help you actually understand what your story is about. And so this is why I'm always dogging on science fiction and fantasy aren't genres, because we still don't know what your story is actually about. You can write a crime story in fantasy. You can write a love story in fantasy. You can write a worldview story in fantasy. So it's much more about setting, but I'm going to get to that. What most people are thinking when they're thinking about their genre is what we call the content genre. And I'm going to get to that one. That's the 5th part of genre, but there's 4 more we've got to look at first. And what we're going to do is take this theme, this idea I have for my story of the message I want to get to the reader, and we're going to start thinking through these 5 different categories and what choices are the best in order to tell the type of story that I'm trying to tell. The first category we're going to look at is the structure genre, and there's 3 choices inside the structure genre. You have arc plot, mini plot, and anti-plot. Now, anti-plot, we're not really going to talk about. That's where you have a story that basically doesn't have any plot at all. It's just random. And we don't really talk about that here at StoryGrid because they're mostly unreadable. The other 2 options are arc plot and mini plot. Arc plot is where you follow the change in one protagonist, and mini plot is where you follow lots of different characters to see the change happening in the system or the culture or the society. So something like a Game of Thrones is going to be a mini plot because you're seeing the whole society and how it works through the eyes of lots of different characters. But when I was looking at my book, since the shift I want to make is very internal to the reader, what's happening inside the reader, I'm thinking I want to take them from feeling like they're broken and they need fixing to understand that they're perfect and have everything they need. That's going to make sense as an arc plot where we're following one protagonist and we see how that change shows up in my protagonist. So for category 1, the structure genre, for my book, The Shithead, I chose to write an arc plot. Category number 2 is the time genre. And there's 2 aspects to the time genre we have to think about. The first is how long the story lasts for the reader. Now, this comes down to whether or not you want to tell a short story, a novella, or a long-form novel, and even how long that novel can be, because you could have a 80,000-word novel, that's what mine ended up being, or you can have multiple hundreds of thousands of words in your novel. So you want to think about how long you need in order to tell the story that you're trying to tell. So for my story, I decided to do a long-form novel. So it ended up being right at 80,000 words. That's kind of what I assumed when I started. I figured it'd be between 60 and 100,000, and I hit right in the middle because the type of story that I'm going to tell and I wanted to tell to make that change couldn't get crammed into a novella or a short story. I needed the full long-form story in order to spin my tale. Now, the other side of the time genre is how long it lasts for your characters. And this is a really fun one to think about. So if you take a story like Pride and Prejudice, it lasts for an entire year. We follow Elizabeth Bennet through an entire year. Then you have stories that can last generations, or you have stories that last just a few moments or a few hours. And what you find when you're thinking through how long the story lasts for the characters in the book is that the shorter that you can make it, the more tension and conflict you get for free in your book. So when I first started thinking through the shithead, I was planning on the whole book lasting about a month for the characters. I was thinking through everything that I wanted to happen, and I thought, a month will be good. That's about how long it should be. And then I started thinking, well, could I make it shorter? Like, what if I did it in 3 weeks or 2 weeks? And then it starts making me nervous because I'm like, oh my gosh, man, my character is going to be really stressed out. And then I'm like, that's the whole point. And so once the final version was done, the whole book lasts 9 days. So 9 days for my entire book. And that was as short as I could possibly get it based on what's happening in the book and the story that I'm trying to tell. But I was constantly trying to figure out if I could cram it in even to less days because you get free tension and conflict. So when I'm thinking through my story and I'm looking at the type of story I want to tell, I'm thinking through the time genre. Do I want a long form or short form or medium form novel for the reader? How long it's going to take the reader to go through it? And then how long it's going to last for the characters as well. That's the time genre. The third category is the style genre, and this one's pretty straightforward most of the time. The first choice you have to make is, are you telling a drama or a comedy? And 99% of you are telling a drama. That's what I'm going to tell as well. I'm not interested in writing a comedy. My story for the shithead has to be a drama. And then you can get deeper into this and start looking at different styles that you can write in, and I'm not going to go too deep into this. But for me, I wanted to tell it as if it was one person telling the story to somebody else over coffee. That is the style that I kept coming back to, is I wanted it to be conversational. I wanted it to be a story with the narrator in first person. This is going to be another video where I talk about point of view and all of that. But in my particular book, it's a drama, and it's being told as if it was auditorially being told to somebody else. So that's the style genre. For most of us, we're going to be writing a drama, so let's move on. We've got 2 more categories to look at. Now we're getting into the real meat and potatoes of these 5 categories of genre, and we're going to look at the reality genre. So what type of reality is the world and the setting of your story? Now, this is where we start looking at fantasy, science fiction, realism, factualism. We start looking at what is the world and the setting that your particular story is going to be told in. Now, this is where you need to think about your theme. You need to think about the type of story you're telling and what kind of world would best fit that theme. Now, for a lot of us, if we love fantasy, if we love science fiction, if we love certain period pieces, we already know we want to tell a story in that kind of world. We have an idea for a fantasy world we want to tell a story in, science fiction, and so on. Now, I'm not trying to talk you out of that. I'm not trying to say, well, no, you can't do that unless it perfectly fits your theme. But what I want you to do is think about how that marries with the theme that you're trying to tell. How does the world support the theme and support the idea that you're trying to portray to your reader? What I find a lot of times when I'm talking to writers and they're pretty set on a fantasy world, if I get them talking about why it's so important to them, why they love books set in fantasy worlds like this, why they love stories told in these types of worlds, a lot of times we can kind of back our way into the theme because there's a reason these stories resonate with you, you care about them, and they're the ones you love to consume as well. And so this is where you want to make sure the theme and the reality genre fit pretty close together. Now, when we're thinking about the reality genre, when I was thinking about it for my book, and I was thinking about how I wanted to tell this story, the way that I came to my book is I had this EMDR therapy experience that was really visceral, and I had all these crazy things happen in my head while I was doing the therapy. And they were fantasy stories. There's giant snakes and giant babies and, hospitals set in weird worlds. It gets really weird. And so there were going to be these fantasy elements. And that's kind of where I started with the story. I had started writing these as short stories, as standalone short stories. And then one day I realized how I could wrap the whole thing and make it a novel and really say what I was trying to say. So I decided to set my book, The Shithead, in a realistic world. It's going to be set in realism. And what realism means is that it didn't happen, but it could happen, right? So factualism is often something where you're writing a historical novel, where you're setting it in a real time and place with real characters. And that's more on the factualism side, where it did actually happen, and then you're telling a fictional story within that world. For realism, we're telling it in a way of like, it didn't happen, but it could happen. And I wanted the reader to really connect and feel like I was telling a story that is their story. And so I wanted to set that in a realistic world because it would be easier for the reader to get there and feel like this is a story that could have been their story. So the main arc of my story is realism. There are some fantasy elements dropped into it as well, but I'll let you read the book to figure out how I work those in. So that's the reality genre. And this is why I think it's important to understand that when you say something like, I write science fiction, that may help on the marketing side to let people know if they like science fiction. But if I'm sitting down to write a book and all I know is that I'm writing science fiction or I'm writing fantasy, that doesn't actually tell me what my book is about. Like I said a few moments ago, I don't know, am I telling a crime story that's all about justice and injustice? Am I telling a love story? Like, what kind of story am I telling? And for that, we get to the fifth category, the content genre. And this is what most people are actually trying to wrap their heads around and wrap their hands around when they're thinking about what their book is actually about, is the content genre. Now, I have a whole video dedicated to just the content genre, and I get into the 12 different genres. There's only 12 different genres, and how they all work and where they come from and all of that. And I highly encourage you to watch that video next. I'm going to put the link down in the description, and it'll show up on your screen at the end of this video. But I don't want to get deep into that because, again, it's a really big subject. So when I was thinking through The Shithead and what kind of story would really resonate with my theme. So the whole idea is my character thinks that he's a broken piece of shit at the beginning of the story, and he goes through this arc to understand that he's perfect and has everything that he needs. And one of the biggest ways this showed up in his life at the beginning of the story is he was always performing for other people, always trying to figure out what would make other people think well of him, what would make him feel important, because he didn't have any kind of sense of self. He was constantly looking everywhere else for his sense of self. And so when I'm looking through where that's hitting on our different genres, I landed on the performance genre. The performance genre is all about the protagonist's need for esteem, for respect. And they're constantly weighing between respect of themselves, respect from first party like their family, and then respect from third party as well. And so to really showcase this, I had my protagonist have this really big job opportunity that he truly wanted, and he went after hard, and he started sacrificing lots of other things for the esteem that would come with this job offer. Now, performance genre shows up in sports, in business, in creative arts. There's all kinds of different ways to do this, and I chose the business aspect of the performance genre. Now, this is the external genre. This is what's happening in the external world that the protagonist is going after and what they're seeing as important. Now, the internal genre I chose for my story was worldview maturation, where my character is moving from a naive view of himself and the world at the beginning to a more wise view of who they are in the world at the end. And this, of course, fits that narrative where I'm trying to take my reader and my protagonist through that arc. And so this is how you start taking your theme and then looking at genre and figuring out what kind of story you're trying to tell. You want to go through these 5 categories and you're holding your theme in your hand, your controlling idea, your double factor problem, and that non-negotiable that you really want the reader to understand. You're holding that right here as you go through each of these categories, and you want to consider your theme for each of the categories. What's the best structure genre to tell this story? What's the best time genre, style genre to tell this story? What reality, what world do I need to build in order to tell this story? And then which of the content genres actually fits this story the best? And then once you have those, you actually have a full understanding of the type of story that you're trying to tell. And it's a much more robust, clear understanding. This whole genre thing is what drew me to StoryGrid in the first place. When I first read the book and I got to the genre part and I saw how Sean explained genre in this really clear way, I knew I was onto something really special. So once you have your theme, you figure out what each of those 5 categories are for your book that fit that theme. So like I mentioned, if you want to keep digging into this idea of genre, I got a couple great videos for you. They're down in the description, and the first one you should watch is about to pop up on your screen shortly. And make sure you go to storygrid.com, check out all the free resources, the newsletter, that's where we send out all the latest and greatest stuff, and check out our next scene writing workshop. We have one coming up next month, and you should absolutely join us for that. But as always, thanks for being a writer. Thanks for being a part of our community here at StoryGrid, and I'll see you next time. Oh yeah, by the way, I didn't actually circle back and tell you what young adult actually means. It's not a genre. It doesn't actually mean anything. Any kind of story can be a young adult story. You can have fantasy stories, real stories. You can have crime stories, love stories. All of these can be young adult. You know what young adult actually is? It's just like a PG-13 rating. It's letting you know there's not too much sex or violence or cursing or anything. That's all young adult really is. So if you see young adult, it's not a genre. All it means is, well, it's like a PG-13 movie. So hopefully that's helpful to you. See you next time.